When my son Brian walked into his mother's funeral service with another woman on his arm while his wife sat crying in the front pew, I knew Dorothy was watching from heaven, and she was furious. What happened next would change everything between us forever, and my son would learn that some betrayals cost more than he ever imagined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of Dorothy's funeral dawned gray and cold in Millbrook, Pennsylvania. Ice crystals clung to the windows of our colonial home on Elm Street, the same house where Dorothy and I had raised Brian for 18 years before he moved away to college and seemingly forgot everything we taught him about respect, loyalty, and family values. I adjusted my black suit jacket for the fourth time, staring at the empty coffee cup Dorothy had used just 3 days before her heart attack claimed her at 67. The kitchen still smelled faintly of her vanilla candles, and her reading glasses lay folded beside yesterday's crossword puzzle, half completed and waiting for fingers that would never return to finish it. The phone rang at 8:15, cutting through the oppressive silence that had settled over our home like a heavy blanket. Brian's voice carried that familiar casual tone he used when he wanted something, the same voice that had asked for money countless times over the past 15 years since he married Linda and started his family. "Morning, Dad. Just wanted to confirm the funeral arrangements one more time before we head over." I straightened my shoulders, finding strength in the routine of practical details. "Service starts at 10:30 at Millbrook Presbyterian. Pastor Thomas will conduct the ceremony. Your mother specifically requested the hymn How Great Thou Art and readings from Psalms." "Got it. Listen, I'm bringing someone with me today, a colleague from work who knew Mom from the company picnics, Jessica Reynolds from our marketing department. She wanted to pay her respects." Something cold settled in my stomach, but I pushed the feeling aside. Grief made everything feel wrong, made innocent words sound suspicious. "That's thoughtful of her. I'm sure your mother would appreciate that." "Yeah, well, Jess is pretty broken up about Mom's passing. They had some good conversations at those company events, you know." I didn't know. Dorothy had never mentioned anyone named Jessica from Brian's workplace, and my wife remembered everyone she met. She had an incredible memory for faces and stories, often asking about people's children and grandchildren years after brief encounters. If Jessica had made an impression on Dorothy, I would have heard about it during our evening conversations over dinner. "Where's Linda? Are the kids coming?" "Linda's got a bad migraine, and we thought the service might be too much for Emily and Jake. They're staying home with Linda's sister, but Jess will be there to represent the company and support our family during this difficult time." The explanation felt rehearsed, polished smooth by repetition. In 45 years of marriage, I'd learned to trust my instincts about people, and every instinct was screaming warnings I couldn't yet articulate. Brian had always been a smooth talker, charming his way through school, relationships, and business dealings with an ease that sometimes concerned Dorothy and me. We'd raised him to be honest and straightforward, but somewhere along the way, he'd learned to manipulate conversations to his advantage. "I'll see you at the church," I said simply, ending the call before Brian could offer more explanations I didn't want to hear. At 9:45, I drove Dorothy's Honda Civic to Millbrook Presbyterian, the same church where we'd been married 45 years ago, where Brian had been baptized as an infant, and where Dorothy had sung in the choir every Sunday until her arthritis made standing too painful. The parking lot was already half full with vehicles belonging to Dorothy's Garden Club friends, our longtime neighbors, and colleagues from Mitchell Manufacturing, the steel parts factory I'd built from nothing and hoped to pass down to Brian someday. Inside the church, Pastor Thomas greeted me with genuine warmth and sympathy. Dorothy had been beloved in our congregation, known for organizing charity drives, visiting shut-ins, and never missing a church potluck with her famous apple pie. The sanctuary was decorated with white lilies and yellow roses, Dorothy's favorite flowers, and the morning light, streaming through stained glass windows, cast colorful patterns across the wooden pews. Martha Stevens, Dorothy's closest friend and our next-door neighbor for 20 years, approached with tears in her eyes. "Harry, Dorothy was such a blessing to all of us. I keep expecting to see her walk through those doors with her purse over her arm and that bright smile." "She loved this church," I replied, my voice steady despite the grief threatening to overwhelm me. Being here feels right. Brian called yesterday to ask about flowers. Such a thoughtful son you raised. I nodded, accepting the compliment while pushing down the nagging worry that had been growing since our morning phone call. Brian had always been good at grand gestures and public displays of affection, but Dorothy had quietly worried about his marriage over the past few years. She'd noticed how Brian rarely mentioned Linda anymore, how he'd stopped bringing the grandchildren for Sunday dinners, and how he seemed distracted and distant during family gatherings. At 10:20, mourners began taking their seats. I sat in the front pew on the right side, the spot Dorothy and I had occupied every Sunday for decades. The church filled steadily with people whose lives Dorothy had touched through her kindness, generosity, and genuine interest in their well-being. Her garden club friends sat together, whispering memories of Dorothy's prize-winning tomatoes and her legendary hospitality. Workers from Mitchell Manufacturing filled several rows, men and women who'd known Dorothy from company picnics and Christmas parties, where she'd remembered their names and asked about their families year after year. At 10:28, Brian walked through the sanctuary doors, and my world shifted permanently off its axis. The woman beside him was not Linda. She was younger, probably in her late 20s, with platinum blonde hair styled in loose waves, and wearing a form-fitting black dress that seemed more appropriate for a cocktail party than a funeral. Her hand rested possessively on Brian's arm, and she leaned close to whisper something in his ear as they surveyed the gathered mourners. But the sight that stopped my heart was Linda, sitting alone in the second pew with tears streaming down her face, clutching a tissue while staring straight ahead at Dorothy's closed casket. Emily and Jake, my 8- and 12-year-old grandchildren, sat on either side of their mother, looking confused and hurt. Jake kept glancing back at his father with the wounded expression of a child trying to understand why his family was falling apart at his grandmother's funeral. Brian and Jessica took seats in the third pew, directly behind Linda and the children. The positioning was calculated, deliberate, and cruel beyond measure. Jessica's red lipstick and expensive perfume seemed to mock the solemnity of the occasion, while their whispered comments to Brian created a bubble of intimacy that excluded everyone else, including his grieving family. Martha Stevens noticed the arrangement and turned to me with shocked confusion. Her whispered question carried clearly in the church's acoustics. "Harry, who is that woman with Brian?" Before I could respond, Pastor Thomas stepped to the pulpit and called for the service to begin. But I couldn't focus on his opening prayer or the familiar words of comfort he offered. My attention was fixed on the devastating tableau playing out in the pews behind me. Linda's shoulders shook with quiet sobs while Brian leaned toward Jessica, their conversation continuing despite the pastor's attempts to honor Dorothy's memory. During the first hymn, Amazing Grace, Jessica pulled out her phone and began scrolling through social media, occasionally showing Brian something on her screen. Their behavior was so inappropriate, so disrespectful to Dorothy's memory and the grieving family that several mourners turned to stare with open disapproval. Martha Stevens audibly gasped when Jessica took a selfie with Brian during the second verse, both of them smiling as if they were at a social gathering rather than a funeral. When Pastor Thomas invited family members to share memories of Dorothy, I stood on unsteady legs and walked to the podium. Looking out at the congregation, I saw faces filled with love and respect for my wife, people who understood her value and contribution to our community. But my eyes kept returning to Brian and Jessica, who continued their whispered conversation while Linda wept openly beside their children. "Dorothy Mitchell was the finest woman I ever knew," I began, my voice carrying across the silent sanctuary. "She was a devoted wife, a loving mother, and a friend to everyone in this room. She believed in family, in loyalty, in treating people with respect and kindness. She lived her values every day, never asking for recognition or reward, just trying to make the world a little better through her presence." I paused, looking directly at Brian, who finally had the decency to stop talking and meet my gaze. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dorothy loved her family above everything else. She was proud of her son and grandchildren, and she believed that family meant standing together through good times and bad, supporting each other when life got difficult, and honoring the people we love even after they're gone. The words carried weight that went beyond their surface meaning, and I watched Brian's face flush as he began to understand that his behavior was being judged and found wanting. Jessica looked bored, checking her watch and shifting restlessly in the pew, completely oblivious to the significance of the moment or the pain she was causing by her very presence. After the service, as mourners filed past Dorothy's casket to pay their final respects, the full scope of Brian's betrayal became clear. Linda approached me, with Emily and Jake clinging to her sides, their faces streaked with tears and confusion. "I'm so sorry, Harry," Linda whispered, her voice broken with grief and humiliation. "I found out about Jessica 2 weeks ago, but I thought Brian would have enough respect for Dorothy's memory to end things before today. I never imagined he would bring her here." The truth hit me like a physical blow. Brian hadn't brought a sympathetic colleague to honor his mother's memory. He'd brought his mistress to his mother's funeral, flaunting his adultery in front of his wife, children, and entire community while Dorothy lay in her casket 10 feet away. The cruelty was breathtaking, the disrespect so profound that I struggled to comprehend how the son Dorothy had raised with such love and care could have become this callous stranger. As the last mourners offered their condolences and departed, Brian and Jessica lingered near the sanctuary doors, seemingly oblivious to the shock and disapproval they generated. When Brian finally approached me, Jessica remained attached to his arm like an expensive accessory, her presence a slap in the face to everyone who'd loved Dorothy. "Dad, thanks for the beautiful service. Mom would have been pleased." I stared at my son, seeing a stranger wearing Brian's face. "Would she? Would your mother have been pleased to see you bring your mistress to your mother's funeral while your wife and children sat crying in the front pew?" Brian's facade cracked for just a moment, revealing something ugly underneath. "I don't know what Linda told you, but Jessica is just a friend who wanted to pay her respects. Don't insult my intelligence, Brian, and don't dishonor your mother's memory with lies." Jessica finally spoke, her voice carrying the entitled tone of someone accustomed to getting her way. "Mr. Mitchell, I understand you're grieving, but there's no need to be rude to people who came to support your family." The audacity was staggering. This woman who'd helped destroy my son's marriage, who'd shown up at Dorothy's funeral as if she belonged there, was now lecturing me about rudeness and family support. I looked at Brian, waiting for him to defend his mother's memory, to acknowledge the hurt he'd caused Linda and the children, to show some trace of the man Dorothy and I had tried to raise. Instead, he put his arm protectively around Jessica and said, "Dad, I think your grief is making you say things you don't mean. We'll talk when you've had time to process everything." As they walked away together, Brian's final words to me echoed in the empty sanctuary. "Mom's gone, Dad. Life goes on and people have to make choices about their happiness." I stood alone beside Dorothy's casket, surrounded by the wilting flowers and fading scent of her favorite perfume, and felt something hard and cold settle in my chest where love for my son used to live. Dorothy had raised Brian to be better than this, and she died believing he was the good man she'd tried to shape through years of patient guidance and unconditional love. But standing in that church, where we'd celebrated Brian's baptism, confirmation, and high school graduation, I realized Dorothy had died not knowing what her son had truly become. The boy who'd once cried when he accidentally stepped on a beetle had grown into a man capable of crushing his family's hearts without apparent remorse. As I drove home through the gray Pennsylvania afternoon, past the steel mills and modest homes that made up our working-class community, I made a decision that would change everything. Brian wanted to make choices about his happiness without regard for the people he hurt. Soon, he would learn that choices have consequences, and some betrayals carry prices that can never be repaid.
The morning after Dorothy's funeral, I woke at 5:30 in our empty bedroom, staring at the ceiling while the Pennsylvania dawn crept through curtains Dorothy had sewn herself 20 years ago. Sleep had been impossible, my mind replaying the image of Brian's arm around Jessica while Linda wept in the church pew. The silence in our house felt different now, heavier with betrayal than simple grief. I made coffee in Dorothy's favorite mug, the one with "World's Best Mom" printed in faded letters that Brian had given her for Mother's Day when he was 12. The irony tasted bitter against my tongue as I sat at our kitchen table, surrounded by sympathy cards from friends and neighbors who'd witnessed yesterday's humiliation. Martha Stevens had called twice, leaving voicemails expressing her shock at Brian's behavior, but I wasn't ready to discuss what I'd seen with anyone else yet. At 7 o'clock, I walked to my home office and opened the steel filing cabinet where Dorothy had meticulously organized our family's financial records for 4 decades. Her careful handwriting filled folders labeled with Brian's name, documenting every loan, every gift, every investment we'd made in his future. Dorothy had been the family bookkeeper, tracking expenses and income with the precision of a trained accountant, and her records painted a picture I'd never bothered to examine closely while she was alive. The first folder contained Brian's college expenses from Penn State University, tuition payments of $42,000 per year for 4 years, room and board costs, textbook allowances, and monthly spending money totaling another $15,000 annually. Dorothy had worked double shifts at Millbrook General Hospital as a registered nurse to help cover these expenses, often coming home exhausted after 12-hour days caring for patients while I focused on growing Mitchell manufacturing. The second folder revealed the real scope of our investment in Brian's future. Graduate school at Carnegie Mellon for his MBA, costing $65,000 over 2 years, a study abroad program in London that added another $28,000 to the total.
Dorothy had even documented smaller expenses, like care packages sent during exam weeks, emergency funds when Brian's laptop broke, and plane tickets home for holidays when he claimed he was too broke to afford travel. I calculated quickly on Dorothy's old adding machine, the one she'd used for decades to balance our household budget. College expenses alone totaled $318,000, not including the interest we'd paid on the second mortgage Dorothy had insisted we take on our house to ensure Brian graduated debt-free, something she'd seen as essential to giving him the best possible start in adult life. The third folder contained records from Brian's early career years, when he'd moved to Pittsburgh and struggled to find steady employment despite his expensive education. Monthly transfers of $1,500 for 18 months while he searched for the right opportunity, a loan of $35,000 for the down payment on his first apartment, money we'd never seen repaid despite Brian's promises. Another $12,000 when Brian's car was totaled in an accident and his insurance coverage proved inadequate. Dorothy's notes in the margins revealed her growing concerns about these continuous financial requests. "Brian seems to expect help rather than asking politely," she'd written beside one large transfer, worried he doesn't appreciate our sacrifices. But she'd never mentioned these doubts to me directly, preferring to support our son's dreams while quietly documenting her own misgivings. The fourth folder covered Brian's wedding to Linda 8 years ago, an elaborate celebration that had cost us $48,000. Dorothy had insisted on paying for everything, determined to give Brian the wedding of his dreams despite the strain on our own finances. The reception at Pine Ridge Country Club, the photographer Dorothy had researched for months, the honeymoon in Hawaii that Brian had requested as a wedding gift rather than registering for household items like most couples. I remembered Dorothy's joy during the wedding preparations, how she'd spent hours addressing invitations by hand and coordinating with vendors to ensure every detail was perfect. She'd been so proud watching Brian dance with Linda, convinced that marriage would mature him into the responsible man she'd always believed he could become. The final folder contained the most recent financial history,
documenting Brian's employment at Mitchell Manufacturing and the various loans and advances he'd requested over the past 5 years. His starting salary as marketing manager had been generous, $45,000 annually plus benefits, but Brian had consistently overspent his income. Emergency loans for home repairs that we later discovered had been cosmetic renovations, advances against future bonuses to cover vacation expenses, a pattern of financial irresponsibility that Dorothy had enabled while hoping Brian would eventually learn to manage money properly. The adding machine's tape stretched across our kitchen table as I calculated the complete financial picture. Over 20 years, Dorothy and I had invested $467,000 in Brian's education, career, wedding, and lifestyle. Nearly $500,000 that represented Dorothy's exhausting hospital shifts, my weekend work at the factory, and countless personal sacrifices we'd made to ensure our son had every possible advantage. I found Dorothy's personal journal in her nightstand drawer, hidden beneath the romance novels she'd enjoyed reading before bed. Her entries from the past year revealed thoughts she'd never shared with me, concerns about Brian's marriage and character that she'd kept to herself out of loyalty and hope. "Brian seems different lately," she'd written 6 months ago. "More distant with Linda and the children. He talks about work constantly, but never mentions his family. I worry that success is changing him in ways I don't like."
I said yes because he's our son, but I noticed he didn't thank me the way he used to. It felt more like an expectation than a gift. 6 weeks ago, saw Brian at Murphy's Diner with a young woman from his office. They were sitting very close, laughing in a way that seemed inappropriate for colleagues. I didn't mention it to Harry because I could be misunderstanding the situation, but something felt wrong about what I witnessed. The final entry, written just 1 week before Dorothy's heart attack, made my hands shake as I read her careful script. "I think Brian is having an affair. Linda called today crying about money problems and Brian's increasing absences from home. She doesn't know I suspect anything, but a mother can sense when her child is making terrible choices. I pray I'm wrong, but I fear we've somehow failed to teach Brian the values Harry and I tried to instill. I love my son, but I don't like the man he's becoming." Dorothy had died knowing that Brian was betraying his family, carrying that knowledge alone rather than burdening me with her suspicions. She'd protected me from the truth while wrestling with her own disappointment in the son she'd sacrificed so much to support and nurture. I called Robert Walsh, our family attorney, and scheduled an appointment for that afternoon. Robert had handled our wills, the incorporation of Mitchell Manufacturing, and various legal matters for 15 years. He'd known Brian since childhood and had been present at the wedding we'd paid for, toasting our son's future happiness while Dorothy glowed with maternal pride. At 2 o'clock, I walked into Robert's downtown office carrying Dorothy's financial records and journal entries. The conference room overlooked Main Street, where Mitchell Manufacturing's delivery trucks occasionally passed carrying steel components to construction sites throughout central Pennsylvania. Robert poured coffee and settled into his leather chair, assuming I needed help with probate procedures and insurance claims. "Harry, I'm so sorry about Dorothy. She was a wonderful woman, and Brian must be devastated by the loss." I opened Dorothy's folders and spread the financial documents across the polished table. "Brian brought his mistress to Dorothy's funeral yesterday. His wife and children sat crying in the front pew while he whispered with another woman during the service." Robert's coffee mug stopped halfway to his lips. As both our attorney and friend, he understood immediately that this wasn't a grief-stricken father making accusations based on misunderstanding or emotional distress. The evidence Dorothy had collected painted a clear picture of financial exploitation and personal betrayal that demanded legal consideration. "What do you want to do, Harry?" I pulled out the current version of our wills, documents that left everything to Brian after providing for Dorothy's care. The language was straightforward, reflecting our assumption that Brian would honor our memory and continue the family business with integrity and respect for the values we'd tried to teach him.
I want Brian removed from my will entirely. I want to change the beneficiary of my life insurance policies. I want to restructure ownership of Mitchell Manufacturing so that Brian can't inherit control of the company. Everything Dorothy and I built together will go to establish a scholarship fund in her memory, helping deserving students who actually appreciate educational opportunities. Robert leaned forward, his legal training focusing on the practical implications of such dramatic changes. Harry, this is a significant decision. Have you considered the impact on your grandchildren, Emily and Jake? They're innocent victims in this situation. I'd thought about Emily and Jake constantly since leaving the church yesterday, remembering their confused faces as they tried to understand why their father was ignoring their grief while entertaining another woman. They deserved better than Brian was providing, but I couldn't protect them from their father's choices. I'll establish a separate education fund for Emily and Jake, money that Brian can't access or control.
They'll have guaranteed college funding, but Brian won't benefit from my decisions to help his children. Linda will receive information about the fund directly, ensuring she can plan for their futures without relying on Brian's financial responsibility. Robert spent the next hour outlining the legal mechanisms necessary to accomplish these changes. Trust structures that would protect assets from potential lawsuits or claims. Language specifically excluding Brian from any inheritance rights, preventing future challenges to my decisions. Insurance beneficiary changes that would take effect immediately, ensuring Brian couldn't benefit from my death even if I died before completing all the paperwork. I need you to understand that these changes are irrevocable, Robert warned. Once we execute these documents, Brian will have no legal claim to your estate regardless of any future reconciliation or change of heart on your part. I thought about Dorothy's journal entries, her growing disappointment in the son she'd loved unconditionally despite his increasing selfishness and entitlement. She died hoping Brian might mature and rediscover the values she'd tried to teach him. But yesterday's funeral had demonstrated that hope was misplaced. Dorothy spent 20 years hoping Brian would become the man she believed he could be. She died still hoping, still making excuses for behavior that showed complete disregard for family loyalty and basic decency. I won't spend my remaining years enabling someone who brought his mistress to his mother's funeral. Robert nodded slowly, understanding that this decision came from careful consideration rather than temporary anger. I'll draft the paperwork immediately. We can execute everything within the week, ensuring all changes are legally binding and properly documented. That evening, I sat in Dorothy's favorite chair, holding her journal and watching the sunset through the kitchen window where she'd spent countless hours cooking meals and worrying about our family's future. The house felt peaceful for the first time since her death, as if removing Brian from my will had lifted a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. The phone rang at 8:30. Brian's name appeared on the caller ID, probably calling to apologize for yesterday's behavior or to check on my emotional state following the funeral. I stared at the phone for 4 rings, then let it go to voicemail without answering. His message was brief and predictable. "Dad, I know yesterday was difficult for everyone. I wanted to make sure you're okay and see if you need anything. Call me back when you get a chance." No mention of Jessica, no acknowledgement of the pain he'd caused Linda and the children, no recognition that his behavior at his mother's funeral had been inappropriate and hurtful. The casual tone suggested he expected forgiveness without apology, support without accountability, the same pattern Dorothy had documented in her financial records for 20 years. I deleted the voicemail without calling back and went to bed early, sleeping soundly for the first time since Dorothy's heart attack. Tomorrow would begin the next phase of my response to Brian's betrayal, starting with changes at Mitchell Manufacturing that would eliminate his expectation of inheriting the business I'd built through 40 years of honest work and sacrifice. Brian wanted to make choices about his happiness without regard for the people he hurt. Soon he would discover that choices have consequences, and some betrayals carry prices that compound over time like interest on an unpaid debt.
Dorothy had protected him from accountability for too long, but she wasn't here to shield him anymore. I fell asleep holding her journal, feeling her presence in the room, and knowing she would approve of the justice that was coming. At 7:30 Monday morning, I drove through the gates of Mitchell Manufacturing for what would prove to be a transformative day in my company's 40-year history. The steel fabrication facility sprawled across 12 acres on the outskirts of Millbrook, employing 45 skilled workers who'd helped me build the business from a single welding bay into central Pennsylvania's most reliable supplier of industrial components.
Dorothy had been proud of what we'd accomplished together, often accompanying me to company picnics and Christmas parties where she'd memorized the names of every employee and their families. Brian's silver Lexus sat in the management parking area, a car he'd purchased with money borrowed against his future salary increases. I'd co-signed the loan 18 months ago, another financial entanglement that would need addressing in the coming weeks. Through the plate glass windows of our administrative building, I could see him settling into his corner office, coffee cup in hand, already checking his personal phone for messages that likely came from Jessica rather than business contacts. I called Sarah Martinez, our Human Resources Director, into my office at 8 o'clock sharp. Sarah had worked for Mitchell Manufacturing for 12 years, rising from entry-level clerk to department head through competence and dedication rather than family connections. She understood the company's culture and values, having witnessed Brian's gradual deterioration from promising young manager to entitled problem employee over the past 5 years. Sarah, I need you to prepare termination paperwork for Brian Mitchell, effective immediately. Security escort, company property retrieval, the complete standard procedure for management personnel. Her professional composure never wavered, though I saw understanding flash in her eyes. Sarah had fielded complaints about Brian's conduct for months, documenting missed deadlines, inappropriate workplace relationships, and a pattern of using company resources for personal matters. She'd been waiting for me to address the situation, knowing that family loyalty had been protecting Brian from consequences that would have ended any other employee's career long ago. I'll have everything ready within the hour. Will you be conducting the termination meeting personally? Yes. Schedule it for 9:30 in Conference Room B. I want witnesses present and video recording as protection against wrongful termination claims. Sarah nodded and departed to prepare the legal documentation that would sever Brian's connection to the company Dorothy and I had built through decades of honest work and careful management. I spent the next hour reviewing Brian's employee file, documenting performance issues that painted a clear picture of professional negligence disguised by nepotism and family protection, project delays that had cost the company thousands in penalty payments, client complaints about Brian's casual attitude toward deadlines and quality standards, expense reports that showed a pattern of charging personal meals and entertainment to company accounts, timesheets that revealed frequent absences and extended lunch breaks that other employees had noticed and resented. The evidence was overwhelming and well documented, thanks to Sarah's diligent record-keeping and my growing suspicion that Brian's problems extended beyond his personal life into professional responsibilities. Any objective review would conclude that termination was justified based solely on job performance, eliminating potential legal challenges that might claim family conflict rather than business necessity. At 9:15, I positioned myself in Conference Room B while Sarah arranged the termination documents with military precision. The room overlooked the factory floor, where skilled machinists and welders were already producing the steel components that kept Mitchell Manufacturing profitable and respected throughout the region. These hard-working men and women deserved leadership that matched their dedication, not the entitled mediocrity Brian had provided as marketing manager. Mike Thompson from security waited discreetly in the hallway, ready to escort Brian from the premises with the professionalism and dignity that company policy required. Mike had served 20 years in the Army before joining Mitchell Manufacturing, bringing military bearing and attention to detail that had earned respect from every employee.
His presence would ensure the termination proceeded smoothly, while protecting both Brian and the company from potential complications. At exactly 9:30, I called Brian's extension and requested his immediate presence in conference room B. His casual response carried the same entitled tone I'd grown to recognize over recent months, the voice of someone who believed his position was secure, regardless of his performance or conduct. "Sure thing, Dad. Just finishing up some emails. Be right there." When Brian entered the conference room and saw Sarah waiting with legal documents spread across the mahogany table, his smile faltered slightly. But his confidence remained intact, probably assuming this was a routine business discussion, or perhaps a conversation about his expanded responsibilities following Dorothy's death. "What's all the paperwork for? Are we finally updating my employment contract?" I remained seated at the head of the table, maintaining the professional demeanor I'd used for decades when making difficult business decisions. "Brian, your employment with Mitchell Manufacturing is terminated, effective immediately, for cause. Please review these documents and sign where indicated." The words hit him like a physical blow, draining color from his face as the reality registered. His laugh came out forced and hollow, echoing strangely in the conference room's acoustics. "Very funny, Dad. What's this really about?" Sarah slid the termination paperwork across the table with practiced efficiency. The legal language was clear and unambiguous, citing specific performance failures and policy violations that justified immediate dismissal. Brian's hands shook slightly as he read the documented evidence of his professional negligence, seeing his failures laid out in clinical detail for the first time. "You can't be serious about this. This is our family business. I've worked here for 5 years, learned everything about steel fabrication and client relations. You can't just throw that away because you're upset about the funeral?" I pressed the security button while maintaining eye contact with my son, watching him realize that yesterday's betrayal had consequences extending far beyond family relationships into the professional realm where merit and character actually mattered. "This decision is based entirely on your job performance and adherence to company policies. Your personal conduct simply provided the catalyst for overdue corrective action." Mike Thompson appeared in the doorway, his military bearing commanding immediate attention. Brian's face flushed red as he understood the full scope of his humiliation, realizing that his termination would be witnessed by employees who had questioned his qualifications and competence for months. "Dad, please, think about what this means for our relationship, for Emily and Jake's future. Don't let grief make you do something you'll regret later." The emotional manipulation was transparent and desperate, invoking family loyalty and my grandchildren's welfare to avoid consequences for choices Brian had made independently. I'd heard similar appeals whenever Brian faced accountability throughout his adult life, always managing to deflect responsibility while positioning himself as the victim of unfair treatment or unrealistic expectations. "Security will escort you to collect personal belongings. All company property must be returned, including laptops, cell phones, and access cards. Your final paycheck will be processed according to state law." Brian's desperation increased as Mike stepped forward, making the termination official and irreversible. "I'll fight this legally. Wrongful termination, age discrimination, whatever it takes. You can't destroy my career because you're having some kind of breakdown after Mom's death." Sarah provided the legal response that protected Mitchell Manufacturing from frivolous litigation. Pennsylvania is an at-will employment state. Termination for documented performance issues is completely legal when properly documented. You'll find all relevant evidence in your file. The escort through the factory floor provided the final element of Brian's professional humiliation. Skilled workers who had questioned his authority and competence watched silently as the boss's son was marched past their workstations carrying a cardboard box of personal items. Their expressions ranged from satisfaction to sympathy, but none showed surprise at seeing Brian removed from a position he'd never truly earned or deserved.
Several employees approached me after Brian's departure, offering support and expressing relief that performance standards would finally be enforced equally, regardless of family connections. Tom Rodriguez, our senior machinist with 30 years of experience, spoke for many when he said, "Mr. Mitchell, we respect what you built here. It's good to see the company's values mean more than family politics." The immediate impact of Brian's termination rippled through Mitchell Manufacturing like electricity through copper wire, energizing employees who had watched quality standards decline under his negligent management. Production schedules that had been consistently delayed suddenly met their deadlines. Client relationships that Brian had damaged through carelessness began showing signs of improvement as more competent personnel assumed his responsibilities. I promoted Jennifer Walsh, our assistant marketing coordinator, to interim marketing manager based on her demonstrated competence and client rapport. Jennifer had been handling most of Brian's actual work for months while he focused on personal phone calls and extended lunches, making the transition seamless and immediately effective. Her first act was implementing quality control measures that Brian had consistently ignored or undermined. By noon, word of Brian's termination had spread throughout Millbrook's business community through the informal network that connected all local employers and professional organizations. The circumstances became public knowledge when several Mitchell Manufacturing employees shared details of the funeral incident with friends and family members who worked at other companies. Carol Henderson, who managed Pine Ridge Country Club's catering services, called to express support for my decision while mentioning that Brian and Jessica had been seen together at the club's bar on multiple occasions over the past several months. Her information confirmed Dorothy's suspicions about the timeline of Brian's affair while providing additional evidence of his poor judgment and disregard for community standards. "Harry, everyone at the club has been talking about what happened at Dorothy's funeral. That behavior was completely unacceptable, and most of our members are appalled by Brian's disrespect. You did the right thing by holding him accountable." Similar calls came throughout the afternoon from business associates, church members, and longtime friends who had witnessed Brian's inappropriate conduct at the funeral service. The unanimous support for my actions demonstrated that Millbrook's close-knit community valued loyalty, respect, and basic decency over family politics or social connections. Dr. Elizabeth Parker, Dorothy's physician and longtime friend, stopped by the office to offer condolences while mentioning her shock at Brian's behavior during the funeral service. Her medical perspective provided insight into the stress Dorothy had been experiencing during her final months, concerns about Brian's marriage and character that may have contributed to the heart condition that ultimately claimed her life. Dorothy was worried about Brian's direction for quite some time, Harry. She never said anything directly, but I could see the stress affecting her health during our appointments. A mother's heart breaks when her child makes destructive choices, and that emotional pain can manifest physically in women Dorothy's age. The revelation that Dorothy's death might have been hastened by worry about Brian's conduct added another dimension to my resolve, transforming grief into righteous determination to honor her memory through decisive action. She had died protecting Brian from consequences, while hoping he might mature and rediscover the values she'd tried to instill through years of patient guidance and unconditional love. At 4 o'clock, I changed the locks on Brian's office and had Sarah update all computer passwords and security access codes throughout the facility. The physical severing of his connection to Mitchell Manufacturing was complete, eliminating any possibility of unauthorized return or interference with company operations. That evening, I drove past Brian's house on Maple Heights Drive and observed his Lexus in the driveway, alongside a red BMW that I assumed belonged to Jessica. Lights were on throughout the house, and I could see figures moving behind drawn curtains, probably discussing the day's events and planning their response to Brian's unemployment. The sight filled me with grim satisfaction, rather than regret or second thoughts. Brian had made his choices with full knowledge of potential consequences, prioritizing his affair over family loyalty while assuming his position at Mitchell Manufacturing was secure regardless of his conduct or competence. At home, in Dorothy's chair, I opened a bottle of wine we'd been saving for our 46th wedding anniversary and toasted her photograph on the mantel.
Phase 1 complete, my love. Justice is coming, and Brian is finally learning that actions have consequences. The phone rang twice during the evening, both calls from Brian's number that I let go to voicemail without listening to his messages. Tomorrow would bring the next phase of accountability as word of his termination spread through Millbrook's professional community, affecting his employment prospects and social standing in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. 3 weeks after Brian's termination from Mitchell Manufacturing, the first wave of financial consequences crashed over his carefully constructed lifestyle like a Pennsylvania winter storm. I received a call from David Morrison at First National Bank of Millbrook at 9:15 on a Tuesday morning, his voice carrying the professional concern that bankers reserve for loans heading toward default. "Harry, I need to discuss Brian's mortgage situation. The payment was due yesterday, and we haven't received anything from his account. This is the first missed payment since you co-signed the loan, so I wanted to reach out before initiating any formal collection procedures." I settled into my office chair at Mitchell Manufacturing, watching through the window as our delivery trucks loaded steel components bound for construction sites across central Pennsylvania. The business ran more efficiently without Brian's interference, production schedules meeting deadlines that had been consistently missed during his tenure as marketing manager. "David, I need to schedule a meeting to discuss changes to my loan guarantees. Are you available this afternoon?" The banker's pause carried weight, understanding immediately that Brian's employment termination was about to create a cascading financial crisis that would affect multiple institutions throughout Millbrook's business community. "I'll clear my schedule for 2 o'clock, Harry. We should discuss this situation comprehensively." That afternoon, I walked into First National's mahogany-paneled conference room carrying legal documents Robert Walsh had prepared with meticulous attention to detail. David Morrison's nervous energy was evident as he reviewed Brian and Linda's loan files, mortgage payments that had totaled $280,000 over 8 years of guaranteed payments. "Harry, I have to ask if we're certain about withdrawing your guarantee. Brian's mortgage balance is still $167,000, and without steady employment, his qualification for continued financing becomes questionable." I slid the legal paperwork across the polished table, documents that would sever my financial responsibility for Brian's choices while protecting me from future obligations. "I'm withdrawing all guarantees effective immediately. 30 days notice as required by Pennsylvania law."
David's face grew pale as he realized the implications. Without my guarantee, Brian's mortgage would require immediate renegotiation based solely on his personal creditworthiness and employment status. His recent termination and lack of steady income made qualification nearly impossible under current banking regulations. This means we'll have to begin foreclosure proceedings within 60 days unless Brian can secure alternative financing or pay the balance in full. Are you prepared for that outcome? The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. I thought about Dorothy's journal entries documenting her growing concerns about Brian's character and financial responsibility. Her final words expressing disappointment in the man our son had become despite every advantage we'd provided. "I understand completely. Please expedite the process according to standard banking procedures." Meanwhile, across town at Premium Motors, Brian's Lexus was being repossessed in the dealership parking lot, where he'd attempted to negotiate payment extensions with increasingly desperate appeals. The repo agent's efficiency was clinical, requiring Brian to remove personal belongings while explaining that his father's loan guarantee had been withdrawn, leaving the dealership no choice but to reclaim the vehicle. Brian's humiliation deepened as other customers witnessed his financial collapse, recognizing him as the son who'd brought his mistress to his mother's funeral just weeks earlier. Millbrook's tight-knit community had rendered judgment on his character, and news of his professional and financial downfall spread through social networks with the speed of digital communication. Jessica's reaction to Brian's mounting crises revealed her true priorities with crystalline clarity. When Brian explained that his termination from Mitchell Manufacturing had eliminated his steady income and compromised their future plans together, her support evaporated like morning fog under harsh sunlight. "This isn't what I signed up for, Brian. I thought you were going to inherit the family business, not get kicked out like some common employee. My ex-boyfriend Rick owns 3 restaurants and just bought a house in Fox Chapel. Maybe we should reconsider our situation." Her ultimatum came during dinner at Romano's Italian restaurant, where Brian had reserved their usual corner table without considering that his credit cards were approaching their limits. When the payment was declined, Jessica's embarrassment transformed into cold calculation about her romantic priorities and financial security. "I need someone stable, someone with prospects. You're 40 years old with no job, no car, and a father who obviously doesn't respect you. That's not the foundation for the lifestyle I want." Brian's desperate promises about finding new employment and rebuilding his relationship with me fell on deaf ears that had already heard similar explanations from men whose circumstances had deteriorated beyond Jessica's tolerance for romantic poverty. She left the restaurant alone, her final words carrying the casual cruelty of someone ending an investment that had failed to provide expected returns. The foreclosure notice arrived at Brian's house on Maple Heights Drive exactly 30 days after my meeting with David Morrison, legal documents that transformed his dream home into a countdown toward homelessness. Linda discovered the paperwork while sorting mail, her shocked tears mixing with rage at Brian's failures as provider and protector of their family. "How could you let this happen? Emily and Jake have lived in this house their entire lives. Where are we supposed to go when the bank takes everything?" Brian's attempts to explain the situation collapsed under Linda's mounting hysteria and the children's frightened questions about moving and changing schools. His promises to fix everything rang hollow against the reality of mounting bills and disappeared income, financial pressures that revealed the weakness of character Dorothy had suspected during her final months. "I'll talk to Dad, make him understand that this affects the grandchildren he claims to love."
Family has to mean something, even after what happened at the funeral. Linda's bitter laugh carried no humor, only the resignation of a woman recognizing that her marriage had been built on illusions about Brian's competence and character. "Your father warned us both, Brian. Remember what he said about choices having consequences? This is what consequences look like." The utility company's disconnection notice followed 3 days later. Electricity scheduled for termination due to unpaid bills totaling $843. Brian's frantic calls to customer service revealed that his employment termination had eliminated any negotiating leverage for payment extensions or hardship considerations. Water and gas services faced similar disconnection schedules, creating a perfect storm of domestic crisis that would soon render their house unlivable even before the foreclosure process reached completion. Brian's credit applications for emergency loans were denied instantly, his debt-to-income ratio having become mathematically impossible without steady employment. Jessica's departure became official when Brian discovered her belongings gone from his house and her social media accounts showing romantic dinners with Rick Peterson, the restaurant owner who represented the financial security she'd expected from her relationship with Mitchell Manufacturing's heir apparent. Her transition was seamless and calculated, demonstrating the transactional nature of what Brian had mistaken for genuine affection. The children's reactions broke Linda's heart more completely than Brian's betrayal or financial collapse. Emily's tears during her explanation that they might have to move away from her friends reflected innocence confronting adult failures she couldn't comprehend. Jake's angry silence spoke volumes about his growing understanding that his father had destroyed their family through choices that prioritized selfish desires over parental responsibilities. "Why did Daddy bring that lady to Grandma's funeral? Why is Grandpa mad at us? Why do we have to leave our house?" Emily's questions pierced through Linda's attempts to shield the children from the full scope of their father's failures while maintaining some dignity during their family's public collapse. The truth was too complex and painful for young minds to process, requiring explanations about adult betrayals that no child should need to understand. Brian's job search revealed the complete scope of his professional isolation within Millbrook's business community. Interview appointments were canceled without explanation once potential employers learned his identity and connected him to the funeral scandal that had become local legend. His resume, impressive on paper with degrees from prestigious universities and management experience, couldn't overcome the reputation damage from his personal conduct. The few interviews he managed to secure ended quickly when employers discovered the circumstances of his termination from Mitchell Manufacturing. Small communities like Millbrook operated on trust and character references, qualities Brian had forfeited through choices that demonstrated complete disregard for family loyalty and basic decency. Carol Henderson at Pine Ridge Country Club delivered the final social blow when she called to inform Brian that his membership was being suspended pending resolution of outstanding charges and complaints from other members about his inappropriate conduct during recent visits with Jessica. The club's board had voted unanimously to distance the organization from anyone whose behavior contradicted their community standards and family values. Brian, I'm sorry, but the club serves families throughout this community, and your recent actions have made other members uncomfortable. We need to maintain our reputation as a place that reflects Millbrook's values. The suspension effectively ended Brian's access to the social network where business relationships were cultivated and employment opportunities often emerged through informal conversations and recommendations.
His isolation was complete. Professional exile reinforced by social ostracism that made rebuilding his career virtually impossible within the community where he'd grown up and expected to inherit leadership. Linda's attorney, Patricia Shaw, delivered divorce papers to Brian's house on a gray November morning exactly 2 months after Dorothy's funeral. The legal documents cited irreconcilable differences while requesting custody of Emily and Jake, spousal support, and protection of assets that might still exist despite Brian's financial collapse. Linda can't continue living like this, Brian. The children deserve stability and security, things you've proven unable to provide. She's prepared to rebuild her life without you. Brian's desperate calls to my house went unanswered, voicemails deleted without listening as I maintained the boundary between his manufactured crisis and my peaceful new routine. His attempts to reach me through mutual friends and business associates were politely deflected by people who understood that reconciliation required accountability Brian seemed incapable of accepting. The foreclosure auction was scheduled for December 15th, 2 weeks before Christmas, adding seasonal irony to the complete destruction of the life Brian had built on foundations of privilege and parental enabling. His childhood home would be sold to strangers, while his own children faced the holidays in temporary housing, consequences radiating outward from choices he'd made with complete disregard for anyone else's welfare. I drove past the house on Maple Heights Drive one final time, observing the for sale signs and drawn curtains that marked another family's collapse. Through the windows, I could see boxes stacked in rooms where Emily and Jake had played and laughed during happier times, before their father's selfish choices destroyed the security they'd taken for granted. That evening, I called Linda to discuss the college fund I'd established for Emily and Jake, money protected from Brian's creditors and guaranteed to provide educational opportunities regardless of their father's failures. Her grateful tears reminded me that innocent victims deserved protection even when their parents made destructive choices. Thank you, Harry. Dorothy would be so proud of how you're taking care of the grandchildren despite everything that's happened. The conversation ended with Linda's promise to ensure Emily and Jake remembered their grandmother's love and values, lessons that might help them avoid repeating their father's mistakes when they reached adulthood. Brian's legacy would be a cautionary tale, but his children still had opportunities to choose different paths. 1 year after Dorothy's funeral, I stood beside her grave in Riverside Cemetery on a brilliant May morning, carrying fresh yellow roses and feeling genuinely peaceful for the first time since her death. The headstone's polished granite reflected morning sunlight while birds sang in the oak trees Dorothy had loved during our Sunday walks through these quiet paths. Spring flowers bloomed along the walkways, creating the kind of natural beauty that had always lifted her spirits during difficult times. Kneeling beside the grave, I arranged the new roses while speaking quietly about the Margaret Foster Memorial Foundation's remarkable first year. 25 students had received full college scholarships, funded entirely by the restructured assets Brian had expected to inherit.
The foundation's cancer research donations totaled $150,000, supporting the kind of medical advances that might have saved Dorothy if they'd existed during her final months. The community center dedication is scheduled for your birthday next month, my love. They're naming the children's library wing in your honor, with a plaque describing your volunteer work and love of reading. Emily and Jake will cut the ribbon, representing the next generation you believed in so completely. Brian had become a distant memory rather than a source of ongoing pain. Working third shift at Turner's warehouse on the outskirts of town for minimum wage plus overtime when available.
His divorce from Linda had been finalized 6 months earlier, with custody arrangements that allowed supervised visits with Emily and Jake every other weekend. The children were thriving in their mother's stable household, supported by the education fund I'd established to secure their futures regardless of their father's continued failures. Linda had returned to nursing school with financial assistance from the foundation, rebuilding her career while raising 2 children who rarely mentioned their father's absence. Her strength and resilience reminded me of Dorothy's determination during our early marriage, when we'd worked multiple jobs to establish Mitchell Manufacturing and build the life we'd shared for 45 years. Leaving the cemetery, I drove through downtown Millbrook to Murphy's Diner for breakfast, passing the warehouse where Brian's night shift had ended an hour earlier. The red Toyota he'd purchased after losing the Lexus sat in the employee parking lot, dented and showing rust spots that reflected his diminished circumstances. I felt neither satisfaction nor regret at the sight, only acceptance that consequences had run their natural course. Inside Murphy's Diner, I found my usual corner booth and ordered coffee while nodding to familiar faces throughout the restaurant. Carol Henderson waved from her table near the window, accompanied by her daughter who was home from college on spring break. Tom Rodriguez from Mitchell Manufacturing stopped by my booth to discuss production schedules and express continued appreciation for the improved workplace culture since Brian's departure. Mr. Mitchell, I wanted you to know that morale has never been better. The younger workers are learning from experienced people again, and we're meeting every deadline without the chaos we used to accept as normal. The conversation was interrupted when Brian entered the diner wearing his warehouse uniform, looking 10 years older than his actual age. His weight loss and prematurely gray hair reflected the stress of manual labor and financial struggle, combined with social isolation that had persisted throughout his exile from Millbrook's professional community. He ordered coffee to go, avoiding eye contact with other customers who recognized him but offered no acknowledgement of his presence. Our eyes met briefly across the crowded restaurant, and for the first time in a year, I saw something different in his expression. The entitled arrogance that had characterized his behavior for decades had been replaced by what appeared to be genuine remorse and hard-earned humility. His slight nod carried respect rather than expectation, acknowledgement rather than demand. When Brian approached my booth after receiving his coffee, several conversations paused as other diners observed our first public interactions since Dorothy's funeral. His voice carried the careful tone of someone who had learned to expect rejection but hoped for basic courtesy. "Good morning, Dad. You look well." I gestured to the empty seat across from me, making a decision based on impulses I couldn't entirely explain. Perhaps Dorothy's influence still guided my choices, or maybe the year of justice and healing had prepared me for this moment of potential reconciliation. Brian sat carefully, keeping his hands wrapped around his coffee cup while struggling to find words adequate for the conversation we'd avoided for 12 months. His wedding ring was gone, I noticed, along with the expensive watch and gold chain that had once symbolized his privileged position in Millbrook's social hierarchy. "I know sorry isn't enough for what I did to Mom's memory and our family. I understand why you made the choices you did, and I deserved all of it. The business, the money, the house, everything. I lost sight of what really mattered, and it cost me everything that was actually valuable." His admission surprised me with its apparent sincerity, though I'd heard similar words from Brian during previous crises when consequences threatened his comfortable lifestyle. This time felt different.
perhaps because he had nothing left to lose and no apparent angle to play for financial or professional advantage. Your mother loved you until her final breath, Brian. She died hoping you'd find your way back to the values she tried to teach you. I acted to honor her memory and protect what we built together. Brian's tears seemed genuine for the first time since childhood, reflecting what appeared to be authentic grief for losses that extended beyond material possessions to relationships and respect that could never be fully restored. I think about her every day, Dad, about the funeral, about how I failed her when she needed me most. I can't undo what I did, but I want you to know that I finally understand what I threw away. The conversation continued for 20 minutes, covering Emily and Jake's adjustment to their new circumstances, Linda's progress in nursing school, and Brian's gradual acceptance of consequences that had transformed him from entitled heir to anonymous laborer. His questions about the Scholarship Foundation revealed genuine interest in Dorothy's memorial legacy rather than self-serving attempts to find angles for personal benefit. The kids you're helping will appreciate educational opportunities the way I should have but didn't. Mom would be proud of what you're building in her memory. When Brian left the diner to sleep before his next night shift, I felt something approaching peace about our family's fractured relationships. Complete reconciliation might never be possible, but mutual respect could potentially replace the anger and disappointment that had defined our interactions for the past year. That afternoon, I visited Grace Matthews at her flower shop on Main Street, continuing a friendship that had developed slowly since our introduction at church 6 months earlier. Grace was a widow like me, having lost her husband to cancer 3 years ago, and our shared experiences of loss and rebuilding had created a connection based on mutual understanding rather than romantic desperation. "How was your visit to Dorothy's grave this morning? I saw you loading flowers into your car when I opened the shop." Grace's gentle questions about my grief and healing process reflected the kind of emotional intelligence Dorothy had possessed, the ability to offer comfort without demanding responses or forcing conversations beyond their natural boundaries. Our relationship was developing at a pace that honored both our deceased spouses and our own needs for companionship during our later years. Dorothy would have loved the Memorial Foundation's first-year report. 25 kids getting college opportunities they couldn't afford otherwise. Cancer research funding that might help future families avoid our experiences. Her values are living on through education and medical advances. Grace nodded with understanding that came from her own volunteer work with hospice patients and grieving families. The best memorials are the ones that continue helping people long after we're gone. Dorothy's influence will touch lives for generations through those scholarships. That evening, I prepared dinner in the kitchen I'd shared with Dorothy for 40 years, setting one place at our table without sadness or loneliness. My new routine included evening walks through neighborhoods where Mitchell manufacturing families lived in homes purchased with honest wages, Sunday dinners with Grace and her grandchildren, and volunteer work at the community center that would soon bear Dorothy's name. The phone rang during dessert, displaying Linda's number with what had become our weekly conversation about Emily and Jake's activities and achievements. Both children were excelling in school, with Emily showing artistic talents that reminded me of Dorothy's creativity, while Jake demonstrated mechanical aptitude that suggested possible future interest in engineering or manufacturing. "Harry, I wanted you to know that Brian has been keeping his visitation schedules and seems genuinely committed to being a better father. He's not the same person who brought that woman to Dorothy's funeral. Prison may have taught him some hard lessons about what really matters."
Linda's assessment matched my own observations from our diner conversation, suggesting that consequences had finally produced the character growth Dorothy had hoped to see during Brian's privileged years. Whether the change was permanent remained to be determined, but accountability had accomplished what years of enabling had failed to achieve. Before bed, I sat in Dorothy's favorite chair, reading letters from scholarship recipients who expressed gratitude for educational opportunities that were transforming their lives. Their heartfelt thanks represented Dorothy's continuing influence on young people who would never know her personally, but would benefit from her memory and values. Looking at our wedding photograph on the mantel, I spoke quietly to Dorothy's image. Justice was served, my love, but redemption might still be possible. Brian is finally learning the lessons you tried to teach him, and Emily and Jake will have opportunities to choose better paths. Your legacy lives on through education and hope. Sleep came easily in our bedroom, where Dorothy's presence remained strong through photographs and memories that brought comfort rather than pain. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities for service and growth, relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation, and the peaceful satisfaction of a life lived according to principles that honored the woman who had shaped my character for 45 years. The story was complete, but the healing continued. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.